So I'll give you the seminars. We now have a marginally functional university. So the first, there's two seminar groups with different rooms. The efficiency gain is one's only 5 minutes walk away and the other one's about 7 minutes walk away. So it's, you can imagine they could design a kind of room arranging algorithm that would actually make the use of the seminar room continuous. Apparently that's difficult in the 21st century. The first seminar group is going to be a group of 20 people, so it's slightly more than are in the room at the moment. That's room 54 in Wilmington Tower. And then the second one will hold about 12 to 15 people. And that's in a small, so Wilmington Tower is the tower block in the centre of the college. Used to be student housing. And it used to be arranged so that girls were on one floor, boys were on the next floor. It's now offices, but they don't arrange the staff in those orders anymore. And the second one is in the terraced house, in the street of terraced houses, Laurie Grove, that the college has. So, yeah, so it's number 13 and it's room 1. Okay, so that should be first as you go in. Okay, so has everyone got that? So basically some of you will go, those of you who want to go in the later group, probably the ones who were there last week, should go to that one, and then, so that's Laurie Grove, that's easier to get to. And then Wilmington Tower, those of you who want to investigate the building. One thing about Wilmington Tower is the lifts, you have to, if you're going to use the lifts rather than stairs, the lifts go to odd floors due to the prior room allocation arrangement. So check that you go to the lift that goes to the 5th floor if you're going to go in the lifts. One goes to even numbers and one goes to odd numbers. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about seminars? Or was it a bit too early in the morning? Okay. So what we're talking about this week is the way that digital media has affected music, or now constitutes music, but also how music drives, and many different kinds of music drive digital media. In the seminar, we're going to look at a text from a recent book on Spotify, so thinking about how Spotify integrates music into a certain kind of service, and think about some of the ways that Spotify has elaborated a relationship to music, and in a certain sense has changed what music is. So we'll be looking at that, and then in this lecture we'll look at a number of ways in which different forms of music, and there are clearly many different traditions and genealogies of music that have been. Is this visible on the screen, by the way, with the light on? Okay. How different genealogies of music have created digital media in some ways, and we'll also look at the way in which digital media takes up certain currents in music, reformats them or exposes them to different kinds of forces that change them in certain ways. So, music as a field in itself is a highly complex entity. It's one of the oldest forms of human culture. If you look at any Paleolithic site, one of the things you'll find is musical instruments that are carved into bone, for instance, flutes, whistles, and so on. So it's something that cannot be summarised in one lecture or in one course. And it has multiple histories from different cultures around the world. It's something that is inherently polyvocal, multicultural, something that is driven by the intensities and the working and the expressions of different cultures. And it's something that has multiple histories. So what the slices I'm going to take through music in the present are primarily from certain kinds of music from particular geographic locations. But it's also something that should be understood to be massively active in multiple different zones through multiple different criteria of what constitutes music. We can say that music, one definition of music is that it's organised sound. So it's something that has a set of reasons to it, a set of aesthetic principles, a way of working on sound, a way of the sound is brought together and integrated into a sequence of tones or a sequence of rhythms, and the multiple ways in which the question of how music is organised also is worked through and reflected in different cultures of music. So what constitutes music, what is inside what is called music, and what is outside what is called music, is something that is varying in different cultures. And it's something that also music takes in a certain way as fodder for the creation of new musical forms. So that the question of what is inside and what is outside music becomes key. And it's something that is a cultural form. It's something that is also both extremely concrete. You experience music as part of this passage of time, as an experience, as an ambient environment that you're part of. But it's also something that is highly abstract. Music is not a picture of something, or sometimes it is, but rarely it's something in itself. So if we think of contemporary debates in cultural theory or philosophy around the non-representational, music, in a sense, has always corresponded to this question of the non-representational. It is in its own terms. So it creates an ambient environment, whether it's a classical orchestra or a sound system on the street. It's something that creates a space in which people inhabit and experience the sound in its own terms. And for cultural studies, music has been one of the key sites of investigation. So if we think of the work of the 1970s, looking at youth subcultures in particular, the way in which music was seen as a key site of people creating their own cultures and creating their own sets of meaning, that Stuart Hall and others called resistance through rituals, the creation of spaces and cultures which allowed for formations of meaning away from what they saw as oppressive social norms. And also we can see probably one of the most influential works of cultural studies from the end of the last century, Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, which looks at the way in which forms of music move across the globe with the movement of people. So specifically, he's looking at the movement of black populations around the world and how, with this movement, both kind of willed movement and unwilling movement through slavery, the production of music, the movement of music becomes a massively inventive force that creates a new global culture that is based around not land masses or nations, but what he calls the Black Atlantic. So the Atlantic itself becomes, as this site of movement and mixing of people, becomes the site of culture itself. So it's a way of thinking culture as a process of migration, of movement, and this book not only looks at music, but also looks at art, literature, political movements, and so on, and tries to develop an understanding of the ocean as the site of cultural production. So So this is one set of backgrounds that we'll take into consideration. Some of those considerations will come through in this lecture. There are many ways in which music is changed by digital media. So many different communities of practice will take the interaction of music and digital media, or the way in which music drives digital media, in different ways. So a number of these, across different traditions of music, would include, for instance, what constitutes a sound. So, if you think of synthesizers emerging into popular and classical music from the 1960s onwards, creation or the development of experimental electronic music, for instance, in the Soviet Union with the theremin in the 1920s, and this production of new kinds of instrument that produce new kinds of sound, and also the way in which it changes composition. And so the way in which certain kinds of music that rely on the music being written out, and certainly not all kinds of music do that. Many kinds of music are operated in different ways, but the way in which music is composed for those kinds of music in digital media allow for new ways in which composition occurs, new ways in which the computer becomes a computational agent, and the way in which digital media as a networked media also integrates forms of collaboration and forms of precision, annotation, and so on, that allow for the production of new kinds of music. Along with that, there is a strong current since the middle of the 20th century for the development of new musical instruments. So I mentioned synthesizers already. There's a strong current that continues of experimental musicians, often in collaboration with computer scientists, all with strong computational knowledge themselves, to produce new instruments that, for instance, sense body movement, or sense heart rate, or sense the flexing of muscles, or that are integrated into movement sensors, for instance. Alongside the development of those kind of musical instruments, you have novel kinds of consumer hardware, for instance, the iPod, and then also come along with the development of new kinds of formatting music. So once music becomes digitized in the 1980s, there's a movement towards extracting digital music from CDs and storing them in different formats. Music also becomes something that, from last week's reading, incorporates increasing numbers of sampling, increasing amounts of sampling. So this is particularly driven by music such as hip-hop, which has been kind of one of the motors of contemporary music, initially from the 1970s to the 1980s, before intellectual property regulations tightened up. It was something really largely composed of samples mixed with synthesizers, but certainly if you look at some of the hip-hop records from that period, the length of samples that they have, the abundance of samples that they include is enormous. I mean, the classical example would be the first two albums of Public Enemy, for instance, which have some of the highest rates of sampling of any music. And you also have this change in music as it becomes computational, as it becomes archived and is stored. So more and more music becomes informally, legally and illegally available on archives that are available online. These create a new condition of music where it's possible to access music in ways that are previously unavailable. So the culture of music changes as music, much more easily access music from any period in history, from any place on the globe, roughly speaking. And so music becomes much more of an archived form. Equally, you have, particularly in music in the kind of the most dense centres of music production, such as London, you have the proliferation of genres, so increasing number of genres, and kinds of music, and micro-genres within those genres. And we can say to complement those changes also that it's not simply music and the means that it's accessed, by which it's accessed, that change. It's not simply the technology that changes it. It's the way music spreads, it's the economics associated with music, the way in which music acts as value creation in different ways, and also the location of music production changes. So it moves, it changes on a global basis, but it also changes from expensive recording studios to people's bedrooms or people's laptops, ultimately people's phones. And also there's an extension of what we can say is the kind of franchise of music making, in that people who previously wouldn't have been able to produce music in ways that would become publicly visible are able to gain access to music making capacity in novel forms, in ways that can perhaps change the balance of what is seen to be music. So, new understandings of what music is, new economics around music, but also new figures of the musician. And how then music is integrated or conflicts with society or different aspects of society in different ways. We'll come, hopefully, if we've got enough time, we'll come to look at some examples of that, and how social media, for instance, has driven or provided a novel context for certain forms of music, for instance drill, that are seen as highly contestational and mixed with other forms other than simply production of organised sound. One example that's often trotted out to argue for the novel way in which music has changed, and the creation of new ways of circulating music in the present has been a track from last year from a Welsh language band. Has anyone heard this one? This band Alpha. It's a rock band, two guys, a very low budget band, singing solely in the Welsh language, and last year was the first time that this band, or any Welsh language band, achieved 1 million streams on Spotify. This was seen to be something that was hitherto impossible, that Welsh would become a language that people around the globe would listen to. But what the claim is that this band, since many people now listen to music with lyrics from other languages on the internet, the claim is that this creates a novel condition in which people listen to music outside of their own linguistic sphere, simply because they enjoy the music and so on. So this is a change in the constituency of music. So this band previously would have, in this image there in the hall of Clwb Ifor Bach, which is the kind of Welsh music club in Cardiff, in South Wales, rather than the kind of the Welsh language heartland of the north. But they would have primarily been only performing to Welsh audiences. Now they have something that looks like a potentially global audience. So that's the network that changes the location and the actors in music. But we can also say in what would be called kind of classical music or modern academic music or contemporary music, there's also been a massive change which echoes and predates in a way some of the effects in different forms of popular music. And there are many ways in which computing was taken up. So music that is programmatic, so programmed music, people writing programs to make music. Music that incorporates chance-based systems. Sort of the 1940s to the 60s, there was a strong influence of the idea of randomness and novel composition forms. Many of you have heard of composers such as John Cage that introduced ideas of chance into composition, but there were others such as Yanis Xenakis, a Greek composer, who really drove that. There are also there's a sense of the extension of the time of music. So Karlheinz Stockhausen was one composer who would make compositions that would last several days based on computers. So it changes the way one inhabits music. Software also produces novel kinds of notation systems. So if you think of the screen of the computer as the surface by which you interact with notation, rather than a piece of printed page with the notes on the usual sets of staves, but also ways in which music is seen as something that is much more mathematically grounded. So the influence of, for instance, signal processing on music through programs such as Pure Data or Max MSP, which allow for musical composition or sound composition to be created solely through programmatic means, solely through mathematical means. And equally, we mentioned synthesizers from the 50s onwards. There's a sense in which these synthesizers that start off as very computationally intense machines, by the late 60s, early 70s, they move into well-known examples such as the Moog, which are incorporated into pop music. At the same time as it affects kind of classical music or contemporary music in that sense, the means of distribution and recording of music change radically. This is a diagram of a timeline that shows different forms from vinyl starting in the 1890s. We could look at wax cylinders as being something earlier, through to cassettes, in which the kind of beginnings of a pirate music scene emerges. And then the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, CDs become a massive format where the record industry thinks, okay, we can make everyone re-buy their music collection in this new format, but don't realise that once they've put something into digital format, it becomes extremely easy to copy given the proliferation of computers. And then in the end of the 20th century, you have some of the first large-scale file-sharing systems, the large-scale music piracy system, which is Napster, a very centralised one. It was easy to close down, but this was a system that broke the floodgates on music piracy. And in the beginning of the 21st century, you had systems such as Pirate Bay, many other BitTorrent-based systems, including some others that are, for instance, Oink, which is a private file-sharing website that created ultimately the largest ever archive of recorded music that was assembled in one place on the planet. It was shut down a few years later, but it was kind of a crucial assemblage of new forms of music that was a very interesting case study in the way that digital media changes the economies of music. So, alongside that, you have the development of new forms of music, and new forms of economies of music associated with it. Because of these platforms are mainly working with MP3 files, that changes the compression of music. There's a form of compression of music that cuts out most of the sound that would, according to the compression designers, not be audible to the human ear. So that means there's an evaluation of what music is and how it's also experienced in a bodily way. If you think of most of the kind of bass-heavy music that forms most of the most interesting contemporary music, relies on bass. Bass is stripped out by MP3. So there's a constant battle between the technology and the genres of music that emerge, and at the same time there are new platforms such as SoundCloud and Bandcamp that allow for bands to address listeners, to address fans directly, so to cut out record labels. So the last 2 decades of music have been radically changed from where they were even only 30 years ago, where the music industry was dominated by 5 big labels. One of those has effectively merged with another, has formed a way, and now we have the capacity for certain artists who know how to play the system very well. Think of artists such as Skepta, for instance, from the grime scene, who are able to work at a tangent to mainstream labels and to work directly with their own labels. So to kind of epitomise the movement of the dream of independent music to become free from large-scale music multinationals. So to follow from that as a case, to think about how London-based, particularly London-based, but also UK-based what's called urban music, when it's being branded in a kind of slightly dubious way by corporations, but it's primarily music that comes from a merger of hip-hop, of reggae, dancehall, and the particular kind of integration of different musical forms in London. If we think of the movement of grime from the garage scene primarily in the late 1990s, or the kind of mid-1990s to the present, the first wave was characterised by a strong emphasis on pirate radio and mixtapes, like cassette tapes, literally cassette tapes, as the way of circulating music. So pirate radio continues to be one of the kind of key infrastructures for music in this city. Anytime there are around 20 to 30 pirates broadcasting, certainly on the weekend, if you want to investigate that, have a look on the FM dial if you've got access to a radio, and you can easily pick up some pretty interesting stations. There was also the development of Channel U, which was a cable TV station, so something also kind of of that particular moment, specifically based around the East End, which was full of homemade tapes, became a factory for the production of grime, where people would produce a tape, take it along to Channel U or post it to Channel U, and they would show it within a few days, if not a few hours. So it's a very chaotic station, but very kind of vivid and kind of active. That basically, along with the pirates, along with a few specific record shops and particular nights in certain clubs, allowed for grime to develop as a genre, as a kind of an economic base that also had different kind of mediatic forms. So many of these artists were kind of had some kind of presence on the internet, but not much. And then by the second generation of grime, which is the current basis of the current kind of media basis of grime, You still have things like the pirate radio, but it's something that is much more based on the internet. So it's something that appears through many social media channels, as well as making a strong claim on the kind of what would be called mainstream media, so TV, music festivals, and so on. But it's a genre now that is almost finds its kind of organizational principles in social media. So, for instance, Instagram channels and so on. And this also means that the people who've worked those systems the best, such as Boy Better Know and other groups, or kind of clusters of artists, have been the ones that have been the most successful. So shifting away from the kind of the mechanics of the record label, the large-scale record label, to social media, obviously is not a neutral terrain. It's not a terrain that is there for people to solely freely express themselves. But it becomes something that changes in a way the grounds for the composition of music and the way that music comes about. And we see this increasingly as another genre of music emerges, which is a genre, drill, many of you probably heard of, that takes off in a certain sense from aspects of grime, but that draws its kind of musical its musical characteristics from Chicago. It's a very, very stripped down, very harsh sounding, energetic form of rap, to use a kind of very crude description. But it's also a genre that has become integrated into social media to an unprecedented extent, to the point that it's also become woven into a moral panic around street gangs and the way in which drill is used as a genre in which street gangs express the message they want to broadcast to their peers, their opponents, their competitors. And it's something that, as such, because of the shift in location of the production of music from heavily expensive studios to people's bedrooms, allows for, as with grime, allows for new social actors to start speaking in public in a way that is often seen as highly scandalous. So, for the first time ever in the UK, you have the police intervening directly against grime artists to prohibit them from posting online. So this area of South London, particularly a little further to the north from here, is based in a group called Moscow 17. They have a restraining order on them from the Metropolitan Police, which means that they have to ask the police for permission before they put a new track online or before they perform. It's an unprecedented intervention by the police into music, but it also shows the way in which communities who had been previously almost barred as an organising principle of the music industry, who were kind of implicitly barred, now become explicitly under a regime of control from the police. This is something that kind of continues from the way in which grime as a genre was policed, but it's something that now, if we think of a musical genre that typifies digital music, grime and drill specifically are the genres that are most characteristic of the internet and its effect on music in the present. So it's a very simplistic generally speaking, is a very simple form of music. It's produced very fast. The raps over the top are generally within a very constrained range of lyrics. But at the same time, it's something that provides an absolutely crucial way of the artists involved in at least imagine they're going to escape from the economic setup that's been made ready for them, that is to remain criminalised. And it's also something that allows for novel forms of expression, novel forms of lyrical expression to be made public. So this form of music, which exists primarily in social media, typifies the kind of expansion of the franchise of music making in the digital era, but also because of the social composition that it comes from. It's mainly black young men in primarily South London, but also North London, some northern cities. Also, there's also this way in which the control structures of society mobilise to close them down in ways that are spectacular in terms of their crudeness. So you have this this extraordinary event, which is these young artists producing music, and at the same time the full apparatus of the state enrolling the collaboration of, for instance, YouTube and other platforms to stop them expressing themselves. This is something that's been studied by Craig Pinkney in the University of Birmingham, and it has its parallels in the way in which increasingly in hip-hop in the United States there is the use of rap lyrics as guilt, or as core evidence, as evidence of guilt. If someone raps that they've done something, it supposedly means that they've actually done it. You know, this is extraordinary if you think of, I don't know, horror movie authors, horror movie directors, or you know, Stephen King, a horror novel writer. He's not been questioned whether he's actually carried out these murders, trapped people in his basement, and sawed their limbs off one by one. But when it's these young guys, it's assumed that it's simply them transcribing their own evil deeds into music. So this what's interesting about this movement is not only its kind of musical novelty, but also the way in which, as it comes to the fore, it also brings out all of these the kind of. I mean, it's hard to describe how crass it is, but the basic kind of racist mechanics of contemporary Britain and the US. Commenting on this, New York or London-born New York rapper MF Doom wrote a track called Rap Snitches Cliches, which describes the kind of irony of people rapping supposedly about crimes they've committed in order to land themselves in court. So it becomes folded back into the music. In a sense, you can see that this music is kind of strong enough and flexible enough that it allows, it becomes able to comment on its own status, its own ability, its own position within larger media systems. Yeah, so, if we think of other cultural forms, if we think of the way in which pretty much every other cultural industry or kind of cultural form has developed on the internet, there are always processes of contestation. If you think of movie piracy, software piracy, and so on. But this is the only one in which kind of active participants have been kind of seen to be so so outside of the norms of social structures, that they can be captured by social media. Additionally, you see in contemporary music forms of commentary on the way in which digital media compose new aesthetics, new forms of understanding, new forms of cultural being. One of the figures that emerges in contemporary music is the figure of the cyborg. Many of you will be familiar with Donna Haraway's 1985 text, The Cyborg Manifesto, or A Cyborg Manifesto. This figure of the cyborg also gets picked up, obviously in films such as Blade Runner and so on, but also crucially in popular music. Missy Elliott's track "She's a Bitch" from '99 uses this figure to compose an image of a hybrid, part human, part machine, emerging from the sea. And more recently, over the last decade, Janelle Monáe has produced a whole trilogy of albums exploring the interrelation with the humans and between humans and technology that is intensely musically sophisticated, but also has a vast repertoire of references to relations between women and technology, black people and technology, and an understanding of power as being embedded in technology. But music also not only reflexively comments on technology, but it also incorporates technology and its failings in novel ways. So here we have a still from Kanye West video from 10 years ago, when Kanye West was still, well, whatever he is now. This image is from a video that he uses glitch as a kind of aesthetic form. So looking at the effects of compression. So we mentioned MP3 having some form of compression. Those of you who use voice over IP, such as Skype, will understand that often there's the production of blocks in the screen. You know, so these are blocks that are produced by the codec software that sometimes begin to act independently of the information that they're beginning to transfer, and then you have layers of the image that are operating at different timescales as they're processed at different speeds. So this very kind of natively digital aesthetic is something that Kanye mobilized in this image, or this video, but it also at the same time moved into things such as textile production, and also spawned a whole genre in contemporary art. We say in a certain sense that music in different ways anticipated a lot of what appears as contemporary digital media. So two people who were operating almost simultaneously in music. One, the producer Lee Scratch Perry, Jamaican-based and now partly London-based producer, one of the kind of founders of dub reggae, used reasonably basic. You see the mixing desk here. This is from his Black Ark Studios, which he built in his back garden in Kingston. Reasonably simple technologies, electronic technologies, but manipulated in ways that created extraordinarily new kinds of sounds that had an approach to technology that was extremely inventive, using tape stretching, reverb, buffering, so using all the kind of the hidden capacities of the mixing desk, almost as a computer, in order to produce extremely complex electronic music. So this is music that worked with the circuit boards, worked with the technical capacities of the media in order to produce novel kinds of sounds. So it's one of the most, he and a few peers, such as Mad Professor, who's down the road in Crystal Palace, his studio is still there. Many of these people produced entirely new genres of music that continue into the present day. Parallel to him was someone who used very similar approaches, but is historically much more lauded, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, a very mystic composer from Germany. In fact, both Lee Perry and Stockhausen, both of them are heavily mystic in different ways. Stockhausen had an approach to technology that was parallel to Lee Perry's, but in a way had enormous amounts of funding and university equipment to push him in different directions. But he worked with, again, working through the kind of hidden capacities of the recording studio to think how you can stretch sound, how you can bend it, how you can subject it to delays and reverbs, but also how sounds can be produced that has novel kinds of frequencies, novel kinds of texture, novel kinds of density in order to produce different kinds of sound experience. These currents in music, in one of the texts from the additional reading that's set, is Sonic Warfare by Steve Goodman, who also DJs under the name and produces music under the name Code 9. Looks at this history. He takes Paul Gilroy's thesis of the Black Atlantic, looks at the Atlantic Triangle in this diagram, and thinks about how sound has another history than something that we simply receive as a kind of nicely arranged melody or a kind of something that's... And what he proposes is that sound is primarily a bodily experience. We experience it as a form of embodied media, but it's also something that is deeply integrated into questions of power. So alongside its kind of genesis in the Atlantic Triangle, it's seen as something that's also integrated into war. So here's an example of a sound mirror, a sonic mirror. It looks like an interesting kind of modernist sculpture, but it's a device for capturing the sound of mechanical movement. So the sound of ships crossing the channel. It's placed on the coast in Kent, where there are a number of examples of them. What a job for a soldier would be to stand on this platform and listen to the sound being captured by this giant concrete ear and bounce back into their ear. So his argument is that sound is always about affect on the one hand, embodied experience, and it's also about power. And this question of power, when we think about genres such as grime or about drill, is core to the aesthetic. Is this kind of expression or manifestation of a powerful musical subject who has the capacity to negotiate or experience this process of power. And Goodman argues that one of the kind of fundamental aesthetic dimensions of contemporary music is this idea of dread. So something that comes through Lee Perry's work, but that also comes through, especially in drill, is this idea of music as a way of experiencing, producing fear as an aesthetic form in itself. This idea of the production of music as something that is exciting, but that is also that works with the ability to produce and overcome and embody the question of fear. So this is something that Goodman argues is essential to contemporary music, that is seen as something that makes music almost de facto outside of the law in a way, in terms of how the Metropolitan Police's music critics now operate, but that also he sees as something integral to the way in which music creates forms of power for people to negotiate their position in society and to change it. Equally, this kind of thesis emerges in Kojo Eshin's book More Brilliant Than the Sun, from the end of the last century, where he looks at a genealogy of black electronic music running from the jazz musician Sun Ra and also Alex Coltrane, who integrated electronic music at early points. In the case of Sun Ra, also super mystic, believed he came from Saturn. So also this production of novel forms of mythology, novel forms of accounting for contemporary civilization, but also integrating electronic or otherworldly sounds into contemporary music as a way of reshaping contemporary aesthetics, to reshape them in a way that would suggest that other worlds are also possible. In this book, More Brilliant Than the Sun, Eshin is really arguing for another genealogy of music that claims that electronic media, digital media, creates a new platform in which those who've been historically super exploited are able to reimagine and reconstitute the present. As another example of this, many of you will be familiar with the artist Burial, also from South London, as all the best musicians are. And his use of very archaic software. So he uses a software called SoundForge, which is anyone familiar with it? Okay, so it's a very simple software. It's a sequencer, so it allows you to put blobs of sound in order. And Burial produces immensely complex, multi-layered soundscapes, but using this hyper simple software, which looks like this. Basically, you add sound to this soundscape, and what Burial claims is that he works with this software almost visually. So he uses the visual manifestation of the sound wave, and he says when it starts to look like fish bones, when it starts to look like a fish's skeleton, that's when I know I'm starting to get a good track. So what he has is this kind of movement backwards and forwards between the sound, what the sound sounds like, and this kind of visual representation of the digital sound. And this means, in the sense that music, I mean, we've talked about kind of music changing its terms of composition. But here you have this double life of music as something that you experience in sound that has, and what characterises a lot of Burial's work is this massive use of sampling of different kinds. And also this kind of very rich, kind of multi-layered use of sound, but also this understanding of sound as something that is represented visually and is interacted with via a computer interface. And so there's something very different from classical forms of composition via notes, but also of traditional forms of music that you'd learn by doing. So this here, the interface interacts with music to create a new space for musical knowledge, musical practice. Many of you will be familiar with this, or be listening to people who are using this. Ableton Live is a software that works with is a DJing software, effectively. What it does is produce a virtual version of a recording studio or a mixing desk, and the DJ will queue up tracks from their USB stick or their hard drive and work with them in the same, or in a simulation of the way that a traditional DJ would work using vinyl, but using this as an interface, and also often 2 or 3 discs that can be rotated in order to allow for scratching or mixing. So this, in a sense, provides another example of the way in which digital media reworks music technology, is by providing simulations or replicas of existing technology. So in this case, a simulation of a mixing desk. And so you interact with it using a touch screen, moving these sliders and rotating the knobs. It's something that often is criticised by some DJs for taking away the kind of tactile sense of interaction, the physical sense of the music. Some DJs completely refuse to use these systems, will only use vinyl. But it's another tendency in the way that digital media reconstitutes contemporary music. Okay, another thing I don't think we've got time to look at. There's a video that I think is really is a great video, but it's also something that's another example of contemporary music taking the digital network form and reconstituting it. So this example is A$AP Rocky collaborating with Skepta, producing a track across 2 sites, so London and New York. And what they do is they take the convention of FaceTime or Skype, showing 2 locations side by side, and have the music enacted in that space. But they also then, in the lyrics, start thinking about this reconstitution of music through digital media. And one can say that they produce the contemporary version of Gilroy's Idiom of the Black Atlantic. So it shows their argument in the video, I would say, is that they show the global nature of post-hip-hop black music as it exists through digital media. So it's a very strong video, but it also includes quite a degree of humour. At certain points, some of the buildings in the video start to move up and down, expand and compress, and so on. So there's a sense also not only of this argument that we know through Steve Goodman's work and Paul Gilroy's work of the network being composed by the Black Atlantic, but there's also that this musical form is itself so powerful that it becomes almost a kind of de facto genre of music for youth living in cities, and also is able to produce a novel aesthetics out of that condition. So I would say this is a kind of text for people to examine. But so this is one of the key, or a really interesting example from last year of a contemporary music video that takes on the question of digital media in novel ways. It shows how digital media is also reconstituted in contemporary music. Okay, so now we've got to remember the seminar rooms. We should be able to. So first group is Wilmington Tower, room 54. So if 10 or 12 of you that don't mind being in the second group, or you want to go and get a coffee or lie down for a bit, come to the second thing, which is in Wilmington.